So today I'm going to explain the differences between Room versus Firebase. So the difference between them is much more simpler to understand. So the difference between them is basically how they perform, how much usage on the CPU and memory usage, and also the different architectures between them, and also how people will interact with them, and also give their thoughts and opinions, and also how would they affect the user experience overall and satisfaction from different architectures and different vectors of the application. So before we begin, I'm going to just talk through each of them. So the main difference is CPU and battery performance. So if the app runs too much on the CPU, it will affect the battery performance because of use of resources, which also means it might cause janky or stuttering, which also means high battery usage. Therefore, it will affect the user's perspective on if the app is viable or consistent over a long-term period use. So it might cause overheating. It means it will burn through the battery faster due to the increased heat in the temperatures. And also that means they would want to know more about those informations through settings or even through the phone itself, so they can know more about like different CPU usage. For instance, even just janky usage, which is a normal idle processing in the background, like transactions, loading tasks, loading UI, loading animations and all that, and optimizing it to use a minimal or some methods we'll call it lazy loading, which I'll explain later, will affect the usage of the CPU and also the memory consumed on the user's device respectively. So older hardware is much more prioritized compared to newer hardware, which is where most of the users will be there. So the difference between them is very important, and I'll show you guys a brief explanation here so you can look at it, how important it is. So most people will experience bottlenecks very extensively and also affect the user experience. So I'm going to proceed to the differences between both architectures, which is the main topic of today's video, because local versus cloud is very subjective, because Room allows locally access data which has no or minimal latency and also works without internet connection. However, Firebase allows for real-time data sharing across different users. So you want to share your data, it's much more available compared to saying locally available, which is much more private and less access to the data. Let's say you want to share it to a friend. A video is much harder because locally it has more restrictions. So it depends on the purposes and also the use case of the features, and also how people actually interact with, how they could track the tasks, how they could know what's going on, like how they satisfied between different designs, different UI. Sorry. And then generate a valid behavioral evidence behind it, so we can know like what participants are actually requiring certain design features, design flaws in the current apps that can be improved, and also certain functions as well, which can improve the overall experience. And also this is a comparison of each vector implementation and how does it scale towards different videos or different tasks as well. So for instance, it can be different priorities and such. It can be a lot more things. However, it can be a lot of ways to know about it, but in general is that the overall app usage comparison is to know, does it use a lot of CPU? Because if it uses a lot of resources, it will generate a lot of heat, which affects the battery performance. And if it uses a lot of processing, meaning there's a lot of data that's going to come inside, most likely the user is interacting heavily with the application, which also equates to higher satisfaction because they use app a lot more compared to the average user, which equates to a successful user design or effective user design, which combines to a better user experience. So for the different these performances on the UI, which what I found was that using lazy column methods to reduce the amount of memory use on the device allows for better utilization on the CPU, low utilization, so even in spikes, which high usage occurs during background loading and also putting in the background, it will allow it to use less resources overall and improve the overall smoothness, which also means the overall hardware doesn't have to work as hard, which allows the user to have a much greater experience from the application. However, if the application itself is very hard to interact, then it will not help. However, this would reduce some of the frustrations that most current apps have, which are very, very annoying, especially when the application itself is very slow and causes a lot of problems. So this is my presentation, and thank you all for getting the understanding or basics of Room versus Firebase.